Hello and welcome back to my channel and welcome to another video. If you are new to this channel, my name is Frank Zhu and I'm a college professor teaching sociology, history and philosophy. I'm also an award-winning landscape photographer. I made a video last week talking about communism and the newly elected mayor of New York City, Zohran Mamdani, who is often labeled as a communist. My point in that video was that those who accuse him of being a communist are either people who know little about communism or people who have a political agenda against him. Mr. Mamdani constantly describes himself as a democratic socialist. In today's video, I'm going to discuss the issue of socialism and try to answer one question which I believe many of you have in mind, and that is, if a democratic socialist can be elected as the mayor of America's biggest city, does it mean that socialism has a chance to become a reality in America? Up until the election victory of Mr. Mamdani a few weeks ago, socialism was largely viewed very negatively in America. It is true that Bernie Sanders, a Democratic senator who ran his presidential campaigns on a self-described democratic socialist platform a number of years ago, achieved some success in promoting his socialist ideas. However, he was largely turned down by voters. His failure proved that the Americans were not ready for socialism, at least not so up until then. In my opinion, the negative perception of socialism is due to various reasons, including past and present authoritarian governments of some socialist countries, and concerns about individual freedom. More directly, perhaps, the strong anti-socialist sentiment is a result of ideological and political propaganda in much of Western media, which is also promoted by many politicians during and after the Cold War. Now, the question is socialism as a system really so bad as it is described in Western media and understood by many Americans? Well, let's find out. The word socialism was first used in the early 19th century by a few European social thinkers to describe a philosophy which advocated public ownership of resources. It was a reaction to the liberal individualism which had prevailed during the Industrial Revolution. However, as a political movement and a social and economic system, socialism was extensively used and popularized by Karl Marx, the famous German philosopher and founder of communism, who was living in the early and mid-19th century Europe. For Marx, socialism was also a stage of social development. In his view, class struggles in the capitalist system would inevitably lead to the collapse of capitalism, which would be replaced by socialism. According to Marx, socialism is different from capitalism in several fundamental ways. First and foremost, socialism is characterized by public ownership or control of property and natural resources. In a socialist economy, individuals do not work in isolation, but work in cooperation with one another. Secondly, production, distribution, and consumption of goods are mostly controlled by government. To put it another way, unlike capitalism, socialism made it possible to plan and adjust production, control distribution, and regulate how people receive goods and services. Thirdly, production, is for public use rather than for profit of individuals. And finally, wealth and material resources are basically distributed equally among all people. As a result, there is little competition in the market, as the government largely controls the economy. In the view of Karl Marx and his followers, socialism has all the advantages which capitalism doesn't have. For example, social justice is done by distributing goods and services to the many instead of the few. Equality is achieved by imposing more tax on the rich and by providing free access to social resources for the poor. Efficiency is possible through central planning, which also avoids excessive or insufficient production. Inflation and unemployment are controlled by central planning through price control. As I said before, Marx considered socialism as a transitional stage between capitalism and communism. In a capitalist economy, a very small minority of people own and control the means of production. They are rich, but the majority remain poor. The system thus creates conflicts, class struggle in Marxist terms. The class struggle will inevitably lead to the downfall of capitalism, which is replaced by socialism. But socialism still has characteristics of capitalism, such as some traits of private ownership of property. Marx believed that the focus of socialism on equal distribution and social equality would eventually lead to communism, which is the final stage of social development, where there are no social classes and people get whatever they need and contribute whatever they can. Nowadays, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, China is the largest socialist country, where central planning plays an essential role. Other socialist countries include Cuba, North Korea, and Vietnam. Characteristics of socialism can also be found in some other places, especially in Scandinavian countries such as Sweden and Finland. Although these countries are generally considered capitalist in essence, their governments play a larger role than in a typical capitalist country. I know it for a fact because I lived in Sweden for a number of years. For example, governments there impose higher taxes on the rich in order to help the poor, and many public services are free of charge to people of low income. Supporters of socialism often argue that the system of socialism is a better alternative to capitalism, which is notorious for its inherent inequalities, exploitation of workers, and environmental damage. For them, socialism is a better system in terms of achieving equality and social justice. They argue that socialism is a better system in providing social services and benefits to the population. They point out to countries like Sweden, Denmark, and Finland, which have aspects of socialism, as examples of successful societies that balance strong social welfare programs with a thriving economy. Having explained what real socialism is according to Karl Marx, I hope you guys can conclude for yourselves whether socialism is really that bad as many people believe it to be, or whether its negativity is only a result of political propaganda. Now, let me discuss the question of whether socialism is possible in America. This question has never caught as much attention as it does now, which is not surprising, considering the election victory of Mr. Zoran Mamdani, who is a self-described democratic socialist. By the way, for those who are not very clear about the term, democratic socialism is a philosophical belief or political ideology which advocates for a socialist economy through democratic processes rather than through a political revolution or a one-party state. As I pointed out earlier, when the government owns or intervenes in certain means of production and provides public welfare systems to narrow the wealth gap, it is a socialist system. In this sense, America already has many socialist elements running alongside its predominant capitalist elements. For example, in America, public education up until high school, libraries, police and fire departments, and public infrastructure like roads, bridges, and water systems are public-funded and managed. There are also many publicly funded welfare programs, such as Social Security, Medicare, and unemployment benefits. Having said that, I have to emphasize that America is far from being a socialist country, and that socialism is highly unlikely to become a reality in the foreseeable future. First, as I mentioned earlier, Marx held the view that socialism was achieved with the overthrow of capitalism as a result of class struggle. However, America has not been a class-oriented society as Europe. The working class in America is a diverse group. Although it is huge in numbers, its strength as a group is quite limited. The development of a unified working class identity has been hindered by a culture of individualism and the popular perception of social mobility. Many Americans believe that they can climb the social ladder if they work hard enough. Such an American dream is especially strong among working class people. Besides, the majority of working class people are so integrated into a consumer society, and so many workers are also shareholders of big corporations that they don't have the motivation to turn against the current system. As a result, the possibility of a political revolution by working class people is almost non-existent. There are also formidable political obstacles. Even though some popular politicians like Bernie Sanders and Zoran Mamdani identify themselves as democratic socialists, a major political socialist party has never materialized in the American political system in the same way as in Europe. Both of the two major parties, Democrats and Republicans, are committed to capitalism and broadly anti-socialist. Besides, as I pointed out earlier, a significant portion of the American public holds negative views of the term socialism, as often associating it with authoritarian regimes, under which presumably there is no freedom. Legal barriers are equally formidable. In the absence of a political revolution, achieving a fully socialist system would require significant constitutional changes related to private property rights and major shifts in cultural values away from the traditional American emphasis on free enterprise and individual accumulation of wealth. Since the very beginning, the American economy has heavily relied on market prices within a system of private property, making the adoption of socialism very difficult. Finally, although support for more socialist policies, such as universal health care, has grown, particularly among younger Americans, such support often translates to support for social democracy, meaning that they only support a strong welfare state within a capitalist framework, rather than the complete abolition of private enterprise. For all of those reasons, I believe that socialism is highly unlikely in America. Well, I think that is all for today's video. As always, thank you so much for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.